Last night, we learned from the New York Times that the National Archives recovered more than 150 classified documents from Trump's Florida home in January, which were squirreled away in 15 boxes of documents. We also learned that Trump personally went through those documents before he turned them over. In a bid to somehow help the former president, Trump right-wing media ally John Solomon late last night published a letter from the National Archives to one of Trump's lawyers. It's dated May 10th. Now, Solomon hyped this letter as evidence that somehow Biden had sicked the FBI on Trump. But as it turns out, Solomon was really sort of shooting himself, or rather Donald Trump, in the foot. For starters, this May letter from the National Archives confirms the New York Times reporting that over 100 documents retrieved by the government in January from Mar-a-Lago, that they were marked classified. The National Archivist details that specifically it was over 700 pages of classified information just hanging out at Mar-a-Lago. Included in some of these were documents with some of the very highest levels of classification, including special access program materials, which even if you have top security clearance, you still need additional clearance to see that kind of document. The letter, again, the letter somehow meant to exonerate Trump and implicate Biden. It also confirms that Trump and his crew had been dragging their feet for weeks, asserting bogus claims of executive privilege in an attempt to delay the seized documents from being handed over to the Justice Department. So while the archives retrieved the boxes of documents in January, the FBI and the DOJ didn't get access to the contents of those boxes until the month of May. Donald Trump clearly has a different definition of cooperation than most of us do. But that is not all. In June, when the Justice Department officials went to Mar-a-Lago to ask Donald Trump, hey, are there any more classified documents lying around? Trump's former CrossFit lawyer reportedly signed a statement saying that Trump had handed over all those documents. She signed a statement affirming, yes, that is it. Nothing else to see here, folks. But even after that June visit, even after Trump's attorney swore there were no more classified documents in Mar-a-Lago, double pinky swear, the Justice Department wasn't convinced. So on August 8th, the FBI executed a search warrant where they found, you guessed it, more documents at Mar-a-Lago marked top secret. The New York Times reported late last night that, in fact, federal agents in total have now retrieved over 300 classified documents, which is hundreds and hundreds of pages of classified material from Mar-a-Lago. That record of obfuscation and foot dragging and false statements is apparently Donald Trump's definition of complete cooperation. And we have breaking news tonight about that supposed cooperation. The Washington Post reports what happened when archives first received the documents in January. Quote, when archives employees began opening up and sifting through the material, they noticed an immediate problem. The boxes arrived without any kind of logs or inventories to describe their content, according to a person familiar with the recovery. Instead, they contained a hodgepodge of documents, including some that didn't even come from Trump's time in the White House. But some of the White House records had obvious markings indicating they were classified. Now, NBC News has not yet confirmed this reporting. The Washington Post report continues to chronicle how the FBI conducted its investigation and just precisely how involved Donald Trump was personally with overseeing the documents. Quote, as the fight with the archives came to an uneasy conclusion, the FBI proceeded with interviews with others in Trump's orbit, including valets and former White House staffers. Agents were told that Trump was a pack rat who had been personally overseeing his collection of White House records since even before leaving Washington and had been reluctant to return anything. The FBI became increasingly convinced that the former president continued to hold classified documents in Florida. It could not be determined who was involved with packing the boxes at Mar-a-Lago or why some White House documents were not sent to the archives, though people familiar with the episode said Trump oversaw the process himself and did so with great secrecy, declining to show some items even to his top aides. Some material recovered in the search is considered extraordinarily sensitive because it could reveal carefully guarded secrets about U.S. intelligence gathering methods. One of them said the information is among the most sensitive secrets we hold. Around that time, Trump attorneys Evan Corcoran and Christina Bobb together provided the Justice Department with a written assurance about Trump having returned classified materials. A person familiar with the matter said the person did not provide the specific wording of the letter, which was signed by Bobb. A person familiar with the matter said the document is of interest to the FBI, which is investigating the veracity of its claims. Joining us now is Washington Post national reporter Carol Leonnig, who is bylined on the story tonight. Carol, thank you so much for being here. It is breaking and it is explosive. I think the first thing that at least grabbed me in reading this article is just how deeply the former president appears to have been in selecting these documents. What more can you tell us about that?
Well, what's clear in both the interviews we've done with sources and also as revealed in a lot of new records and letters that are coming out is that the president was very involved, the former president was very involved in, at the last minute, hastily and chaotically packing up his documents that he thought were quote unquote his, and arranging for them to be taken to Mar-a-Lago, his private club and part-time residence. And that also importantly, Alex, despite the former president's claim that all he's done has been cooperative, what we found is that week after week, he was the person resisting providing records. He was the person, along with his lawyers, asking for delay in allowing the FBI, for example, to look over the classified records that they found, to their horror, to their shock, in a group of 15 boxes of records that they retrieved from Mar-a-Lago. And so the former president is very, very much at the center of this drama. And now his own advisors, legal and otherwise, are growing increasingly concerned and have been since June that this is a criminal investigation in which the former president is in legal jeopardy, ultimately of his own making. That if perhaps he had turned over the records willingly and forthrightly right away in January or in December or in the fall of 2021, all of these times that it was asked for, that it might not have morphed into a criminal investigation looking at the willful retention of some of the highest and most sensitive secrets our government holds.
Yeah, I think we should focus on that a little bit, because this isn't like a former president sitting at his kitchen table leafing through memorabilia that he mistakenly brought home, right? I mean, you specifically say in the story that he was going through these documents with, quote, great secrecy, declining to show some items even to top aides. And what are we talking about, Carol? I mean, some of the most sensitive secrets we hold. Can you talk more about that and just the amount of, I mean, not only the recognition of that among the people reporting on this story, but within Trump's circle, it sounds like nobody really wanted to touch this case with a 10-foot pole.
Oh, such a good point. And I promise we will circle back to that, Alex, about the 10-foot pole that a lot of people were avoiding taking hold of. So your first question about the sensitivity of this material, as described in the inventory, some of this material is top secret, secure, compartmented information. That means that people have to, as you described earlier so well, people who are in government have to have an absolute reason to know and access this information as part of their job. It has to be somebody who's incredibly trustworthy and has this very high security clearance. And usually secure compartmented information involves intelligence gathering methods. The records that were seized on August 8th, just as the FBI and the Department of Justice feared, were some of those holiest of holy kinds of records that, if shared indiscriminately or handled carelessly in a private restaurant, club, if ever disclosed, would cause immediate grave danger to national security, because it would reveal how the U.S. gathers the intelligence that it has. That includes, for example, which allies provide us special intelligence that they don't share with others. That includes, for example, covert programs that we have that gather intelligence. And if those details were revealed to a foreign adversary, our chances of protecting national security would be greatly diminished. Grave threats. Now, you asked that good question about people who during this period who worked for Donald Trump or were in the Trump orbit trying to avoid being involved in this case. Starting in the fall of 2021, Donald Trump was resisting turning over records he believed were, quote unquote, mine, meaning his. And the archives knew that he had a lot of records, that things were missing, that they needed them. Eventually, Donald Trump's team turned over 15 boxes of records. The shocker for people who had previously worked in President Trump's White House counsel's office was that those records included highly classified materials. When they were notified, in particular, Deputy White House Counsel Patrick Philbin, when he was notified in April that the National Archives found that there was classified information in these documents, he was stunned. And he was being asked at that time to help Team Trump review the records, to go up to the National Archives and review what had been turned over and figure out what are in these boxes, which you would think they would have looked before. But Patrick Philbin and others backed away from this request by Team Trump. And pretty soon the FBI was knocking on their doors, asking the Deputy White House counsels, we need to interview you. You're now a subject witness. You may be a witness for us about what's going on in this withholding of what appear to be incredibly sensitive documents.
At this point, can you really blame any lawyer who doesn't want to work for Donald Trump? Carol Leonnig, Washington Post national reporter, thank you so much for joining us this evening and with that breaking news to boot.